And right now, we're going to kick off our first Zero Carbon Industry event of Eceee here in Antwerp today. My name is Clemens Roder. I'm one of the vice presidents of Eceee, and I'm chairing this first plenary session for you today. And we're going to have three very distinguished speakers today, which I will introduce afterwards. Eceee is hosting that event, and for all of you who don't know Eceee, very few words about Eceee. Eceee is a membership-based organization promoting the importance of energy efficiency in Europe. Eceee's work is based on evidence, so we are hosting various events together with people from science, from industry, with policymakers to exchange knowledge, to share knowledge, to provide knowledge to decision makers. And most popular, of course, of Eceee are the summer study events, the biennial summer study events, where we meet and discuss energy efficiency in the various contexts for more than 2 decades now. If you want to support the work of Eceee and you are not yet a member, we strongly encourage you to become a member of Eceee and to support our work, to support events like that. Without our members, without the support of our members, we are not able to host and facilitate such events. Our members are one of the important pillars to enable such events, but there's of course another important pillar, and those are our sponsors. Currently you don't see them on screen, but afterwards and always in the breaks you will see our slideshow running on through. Look at them at the website too. So thank you very much to our sponsors. Without you, this event wouldn't have been possible. In this plenary, we're gonna have 3 presentations from very different angles on the topic of industrial transformation, on the topic of zero carbon industry. And as the first presenter, we have Anne-Frédérique Desmarel from the Port of Antwerp, which is a very interesting start for such an event, because in our community, we usually don't really talk about the infrastructure which enables the transition. When we talk about infrastructure, we talk about electricity grids, we talk about gas grids. That's the infrastructure we think about. But harbors are one of the most important infrastructures, in particular when it comes to the energy transition and of the future, when we think about the importing new energy carriers, enabling the energy transition, the zero carbon transition of industry. And therefore, I'm very much looking forward to Anne-Frédérique's presentation. Anne-Frédérique, she obtained a master's degree in bioengineering in chemistry at the University of Leuven in 2005, and then she did another master's degree in management and started her professional career in the chemical industry within the large industry business unit of Air Liquide. And she had experience in operational as well as in commercial rules in that company. And then in 2017, she joined the Port of Antwerp as the business development manager, and today she's taken the role of the program manager for industrial transition, enabling the transition towards a climate neutral port. And I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to all. I'm glad to see that you're many to attend this Zero Carbon Industry Conference in Antwerp today. My name is indeed Anne-Frédérique Desmarel, Program Manager Industrial Transition at the Port of Antwerp, Bruges. And I have the honor to welcome you all here in the Flanders Meeting and Conference Center. In our organization, we prefer speaking of climate neutral or low carbon instead of zero carbon industry. Because with the presence of Europe's largest integrated chemical hub in our port, which is mainly a hydrocarbon producing cluster, we believe that this is more appropriate. But as a Port of Antwerp, Bruges, we support the initiative to accelerate the shift and are therefore happy to support you and be here today. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the Port of Antwerp, Bruges, and therefore I decided to share a couple of slides. The Port of Antwerp, Bruges is the second largest port of Antwerp, and since the merger of the Port of Antwerp and the Port port of Zeebrugge in the spring of this year, we are one unified port active on 2 platforms. And this unified port is a leading container port. It's Europe's largest export port. It's the port with the largest throughput for vehicles, but we also host the largest integrated chemical cluster in Europe, and we are the port where about 15% of Europe's gas arrives. With about 1,400 private companies active on our platform, generating more than 160,000 jobs, the Port of Antwerp-Bruges is Belgium's most important economic driver. And it is our ambition to reconcile economy, people, and climate. We want to become the first global port to do so. And as you may expect, industry plays a key role in achieving this goal. This overview slide gives you, in a nutshell, a summary of what's happening on the industrial side here in Antwerp. So the cluster is highly integrated with a very good maritime connection and a good pipeline, rail, and barge connection towards the hinterland. Each year, about 40 million tons of oil is imported and refined. And the chemical output on a yearly basis is about 20 million tons, with a wide variety of intermediate and final products produced in more than 30 different companies with one or more production facilities running in the Port of Antwerp. The other side of the coin is that this high level of activity, as you can see here on the slide, results in about 16 million tons of CO2 emissions on a yearly basis, out of the roughly 18 million tons of CO2 that is emitted in the whole port area. So it's quite significant. The mission of Port of Antwerp-Bruges Sustainable Transition Team is, together with many other colleagues in our organization, to prepare our platform to become the green energy hub of the future, where CO2 can be captured, collected, and exported to CO2 storage facilities, where renewable energy under the forms of electrons arrive, and where green molecules as hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, or others can be shipped in, stored, distributed, processed, and imported to the European hinterland. It will be a hub in which circularity also plays an important role, where sustainable resources are processed and where waste streams are valorized. And today we work on many different projects with many different stakeholders to make this transition happen. Think of the development of a green hydrogen import chain in the Hydrogen Import Coalition project, the Antwerp at Sea project, which is the development of the CCUS value chain in the Port of Antwerp, but also the development of waste heat networks, or the development of a circular hotspot and demonstration area on Next Gen District, a former automotive site. We see many opportunities, but also a couple of challenges. And those challenges have different origins. And I believe that we can categorize them in 3 different categories. You have the challenges that are more project-related, you have challenges that are more technical, and challenges that are related to policy. And concerning the first categories, the project-related challenges, I think especially of those projects where whole new value chains are developed. Example, the import of green molecules, or the development of a CCUS value chain. Because those value chains exist of different parts, different pieces of infrastructure that need to be developed in parallel and should be aligned. And therefore, synchronization of development is very important. And that may sound easy, but it is not always the case. And that brings us to the challenges that are more technical, because in those kind of projects, for example, the Antwerp at Sea project, the development of a carbon capture chain with a focus on export of CO2 at a quite important scale, it is a first of a kind, and it's not a copy-paste project of an existing initiative. Nothing has been standardized yet. So questions on specifications, what specifications will be used for transporting CO2 by pipeline, transporting CO2 by ship, for storing CO2, those questions must be answered. And we must ensure that all the components in the chain are compatible with each other. The same goes for the import of hydrogen, but also, for example, in chemical recycling. Which specifications should be obtained so that companies further in the value chain can use the output as feedstock? And last but not least, there are challenges related to policy. Policy plays a very important role in the transition and can be an enormous driver for new low-carbon investments, but can also put a brake on those developments if unclear or uncertain. Those challenges are quite specific per topic, and it would bring me too far into detail for this opening session, but therefore it is good to have platforms like this conference, where those challenges can be addressed in specific panels. And I want to conclude by wishing you intense and fruitful discussions and information exchange on the industrial transition today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting presentation. So to all the people with questions, introduce yourself quickly with your name and your institution, please.
My name is Henrik Adler Nielsen. I'm from the Danish Energy Agency. I wonder if it's only me, but I can't see where's the production of ammonia or e-methanol for the ships that is going to enter your harbor and leave again. What do they need in the future when they don't need oil? What would you do then? Because as far as I can see, it's not on the...
Well, we live in a small country with a high population density, and we, as a Port Authority, we do not believe that we will be able to produce all the renewable energy that we will need locally. Partly, it will be produced locally and maybe transformed, but we strongly believe that we will need to import renewable energy under the forms of hydrogen or other hydrogen carriers like methanol and ammonia. And so what we do as a Port Authority is work on the infrastructure that will allow us to import, store, distribute and process those molecules.
But do you expect many ships in the future if you don't, if you're not available to provide them fuel for their next trip? I mean, they can come in, they can deliver a lot, but how do they get fueled in the future?
Oh, yeah, it's not on this slide, but of course we are also developing the required bunker facilities to be able to bunker alternative shipping fuels in the future. Today we do that with LNG, but we are also doing the preparative work to be able to bunker methanol, probably also hydrogen and ammonia in the future.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Dusan Jakovljevic. I'm from Energy Efficiency Industrial Process, which is Association for Industrial Energy Efficiency. I mean, looking at your map, you know, I see a lot of hydrogen there. I mean, for us, you know, we have been advocating kind of the best way to decarbonize industrial energy is to electrify. And here you have basically conversion of electricity to hydrogen, and it's, I mean, looking from energy efficiency perspective, hydrogen is not really something that one can really kind of promote because it's very, very low on energy efficiency. And my question is, do you consider kind of any part of your system to kind of go electric, to electrify, especially with the logistics and the carriers?
Sure, and you can see it on the slide as well, on the left-hand side. The port of Zeebrugge is an important offshore wind platform for our country. So the we are also next to the import of green molecules, we also work on the further development of the renewable energy production and the infrastructure that is needed to use it in industry. But of course, as a port authority, we have to work together with for example, Elia, which is our electricity provider in Belgium, or electricity infrastructure provider.
Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Tom van Dril from TNO Netherlands. The Gent-Terneuzen industrial area is right in the center of the Port Authority area. How do you cooperate with them on decarbonization?
That's correct from a geographical point of view. And I think you can elaborate or expand that question to clusters more in the north, in the ARA region, because from a global point of view, we are one integrated cluster. And it's always a difficult question to answer, but there is already a collaboration today. There are a lot of, it's an integrated cluster, so products produced in Antwerp are going to the different other industrial clusters in Belgium and in neighboring countries. But probably there is also room for improvement on that point, I believe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one final question.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Very interesting. Thomas Novak, European Heat Pump Association, and a sailor myself, so always interested in ports. Do you have a timeline for any of this? Because a lot of the technologies that you show here are still in their infancy. So when do you hope to be finished with that concept?
That's also a very good question. For the different topics we are, or for all the things that you see on this slide, different projects are identified and are rolled out today. They do not have all the same timeline, but for example, for the development of CO2 infrastructure, our ambition is to have the first part of the infrastructure operational 2025. For the import of green molecules, our roadmap is to have first pilot plants operational in 2027. So between now and 2030, a kickoff and a further gradual scaling of infrastructure.
We will continue with the next speaker, which is Lars Nilsson from Sweden, from University of Lund. So he is a professor for environmental and energy systems and head of the Department of Technology and Society at Lund University, and has been researching a lot on the topic of industrial decarbonization and the co-evolution of industrial decarbonization with energy system transitions in the perspective of circular economy, and has been very active in various IPCC reports. I will not name them all, that would take too long and take away the time from your presentation. So I'll leave the presentation and the floor to you, Lars, and go ahead, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Clemens. I'm also, since the spring, a member of the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change, which is quite interesting. And the most important thing is that I'm a member of Eceee for more than 25 years. I think that must be said. So I will start with the big picture and the IPCC report that came out this spring, and then sort of work my way down into the industry topic. You may all be familiar with this sad story. We're not at all on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. On the contrary, we're overshooting. We're not going to make the 1.5 degree target. I think most people agree now, but it will be sort of an overshoot. We should still keep the target and try to get back to 1.5. But it's basically impossible this point. We have, of course, the European targets, and we have relatively soon, I think in 23 or 24, we're going to set the 2040 target for the European Union. We're still very reliant on fossil fuels, and as you see here, the fossil fuels really have to be phased out, whatever target we have. It means an end to fossil fuels and feedstock. And I think this is where the real difficulty lies in terms of getting political agreement, because it's such tremendous assets and so much value in fossil fuel assets and fossil fuel exports. So that's really what's preventing a lot of progress here. So it's a bit of a dark picture. Maybe you also read in the papers how in Sharm el-Sheikh there were more fossil fuel interests than ever at a COP. Of course, interested in fighting off any high ambitions. But there are also some positive signs that we try to highlight in the IPCC report. There are several countries, regions that have shown sustained emission reductions over a long time. European Union is at roughly minus 30% compared to 1990, I think. Climate policies are spreading. And we, of course, have all these other initiatives with cities and regions and ports, not least, and many companies adopting targets and reporting their emissions. So there are some positive developments. For me, the biggest sort of game changer is the rapid reduction in the cost of solar cells and wind power, which now begins or is already in some places competitive with fossil fuels. And cost reductions are expected to continue. And this is really changing the whole logic of energy. We've been, for hundreds of years, we've been burning fuels to produce electricity, taking 2 or 3 units of fuel to make that electricity. But if electricity, with the huge potentials for solar and wind, if electricity becomes the primary energy carrier, we get electricity as the primary energy carrier, first we should use it and electrify rather than having losses through hydrogen. But it also means that we will use electricity to produce fuels. So 2 units of electricity to produce 1 unit of gaseous or liquid fuel. So it's very different from historical situation. The uptake of those technologies increasing really rapidly, although they're still small part of the global electricity production, 3% for photovoltaics, 6% for onshore wind. Pure battery vehicles, still not that common. But it's interesting to think about this renewables-based future. So historically, we have often industries located close to fossil fuel resources, close to the resources or possibly the markets, often near the coast. And if we think about a global future powered by renewable energy, we can start thinking about where those resources are located. So if we look for wind, for example, down here, Midwest, Northern Europe, parts of Australia here also, Inner Mongolia. And then we can have a quick look at the solar resources and think about locating energy-intensive industries to those regions that are very rich in resources. And that could be in northern Scandinavia, but it could be other parts of the world. So for example, South Korea, instead of importing coal and iron ore from Australia, could import iron and then make the high-quality steel in Korea from that in electric arc furnaces. You could actually also think about, now the solar resource doesn't look that great up here, but it's pretty good in the summer. And a couple of years ago, if you would have asked, I would say it's crazy to put solar cells in the Arctic. But if we imagine a future with a lot of electricity-intensive industry in that region, we're going to see high demand for electricity also in the summer. So it's not at all crazy to put solar cells in the Arctic. And the funny thing is that because of the midnight sun, you don't have to tilt them towards the sun. You can put them vertically like this. So instead of getting this production curve, you get a production curve with two peaks as the sun moves around the solar cells. So I think a lot of things happen, things that we didn't really imagine even a few years ago. Okay. So I first started thinking, you mentioned the IPCC, I first started thinking about electrification back in 2009, actually, when we were working on a special report on renewable energy. And I was asked to write in a chapter called Integration, and I was asked to write the part on industry. So it was about how do you integrate renewable energy into industry. So I scratched my head and thought, well, it's not like buildings where you can put some solar cells on the roof. It doesn't work for a steel plant. But that's when I started to think, okay, renewable energy, the huge potentials, that's electricity, and that's why I started to think about electrification, and specifically electrification of the heavy energy and asset-intensive industries with long investment cycles, so especially chemicals, iron and steel, but also cement, and how they could be electrified or use hydrogen. Because it's really a key solution. If you think about these basic materials that society needs, and we really need them also for decarbonizing all other sectors. I see Clemens Schneider smiling. I think he did the figure to the left there. We'll come to that briefly. But the stuff we need, and if you think about the abatement options in the primary production steps, it's basically carbon capture and storage. It could be bio-based, but that's a limited resource. And then it could be electrification and hydrogen. It's a bit tricky because it has few, if any, co-benefits. It basically makes your materials more expensive, ranging from 30% for steel with hydrogen reduction to twice or 3 times more expensive plastics. And this is from a paper we did a few years ago, I think 2016 or 17, where we basically calculated how much electricity would you need to electrify straight off the European basic materials industry. And you see the big chunk here is about basic chemicals and feedstock for basic chemicals. The other big part here is steel. Now the thing is, these guys, they need hydrogen, so hydrogen reduction, for example, for iron. And that's also interesting in the way that since they need hydrogen, they also offer a great potential for balancing the power grid, producing hydrogen when the wind is strong, etc. Now this is if you do it in a bit of a stupid way. Other studies, material economics, looked into the possibilities of using less, increasing recycling, etc. And then you can avoid maybe half of the primary production. So maybe it's only 700 terawatt hours or something. Still big, but doable from a resource perspective. Now, moving into what we talked about in the IPCC report, we looked at a range of mitigation options, all the way from sort of demand management over materials efficiency, circularity, energy efficiency, of course, which remains first, also for fossil-free industry. Then coming to electrification and hydrogen, we tried to highlight, I think, what we heard this morning about high-temperature industrial heat pumps, really interesting technology being developed. And then thinking also about fossil-free carbon feedstock, how do you get your carbon in the future for all the organic materials and chemicals that you need, and at the end CCS where necessary. And as I said, things have moved quite quickly. This is from a Swedish business paper, April 2016. It says, this is the way that the steel industry will become fossil-free. And you have the CEOs of the mining company, the power company, and the steel company saying that they will go for hydrogen. And this is a situation right after the Paris Agreement, where they are looking a few years ahead, thinking about, we need a new coke oven, we need new blast furnace, assets that will be there for 40 years, and now they're saying we're going for zero emissions, maybe not the best investment. So they sort of broke ranks with the European Steel Industry Association and their narrative and said, we're going to do this. They were almost ridiculed by other parts of the European steel industry, but then later others have followed, of course. And now since, 2020, the pilot plant, which is 1 ton per hour, and the first 100% hydrogen reduced iron was produced in 2021. Really interesting. Also followed by another initiative called H2 Green Steel that I think is represented here. Ulla Hansen, have you arrived? No? Tomorrow. He's coming tomorrow. Then I didn't have to mention them. But anyway, and also perceptions changing in industry, because we were asking, for example, Scania in 2017 or 18, are you prepared to buy this green steel? Are you prepared to buy a premium pay a premium for green steel? And they said, no, not possible. And then 1 or 2 years later, their CEO stood up at one of these big fairs in Germany and said, yes, we're going to buy this green steel. We're going to green our trucks. So that has been moving along with Volvo, Mercedes, Scania, jumping on this train. We have in Sweden a car company called Polestar making battery cars based on Volvo. They came out last year and said, now if you use our car, you drive it with green electricity, you have zero emissions. But unfortunately, the manufacturing is causing 26 tons of CO2. And we are aiming to bring that to zero in 2030. So they are working intensively now with suppliers and materials producers to reduce the emissions from the manufacturing. But it's not only about this new stuff. I want to take you to a museum. If you can place yourself in the year 2053, and this is a museum called Carbon Ruins. It explains the transition for how Sweden became a fossil-free welfare state by 2045. And it also highlights some of the things that have to go. And it will be really interesting to see what happens between now and 2030 in terms of the fossil fuel industry. In this scenario, Equinor divests fossil fuels, BP goes bankrupt, French Total is taken over by EDF, and some of the others have to merge to survive. So it's also all this stuff that has to go away. But it's not only that. I think it's also about norms, social norms. And this is one of my favorite exhibits. I don't know, remember you're now in 2053. I don't know if you remember those frequent flyer cards that people had around 2010 that gave you access to lounges and free bubbly wine, etc. Really strange to look at this in retrospect. So also not only about technologies, but also about social norms and consumption, I think. So to sum it up, Paris Agreement means zero negative emissions. That's very different from thinking about 20, 30, 40% emission reductions, because zero is zero. We have this development with renewable electricity, which is important for the possibilities. We know it's about systemic changes. We know there will be new sectoral couplings, new value chains. Think about hydrogen steelmaking, very different from previous value chains. Need to think about geographical location. Possibly slightly more expensive basic materials, but this is something that can be handled. It's a very little part of cost of products. And also huge infrastructure needs, of course, like I think we will hear more about. Part of the IPCC chapter also talk about policies that are needed. And this is basically what it contains in a slightly different form. Informed by innovation system studies, the need for directionality. You need a clear path of development through visions, roadmaps, strategies, and of course, zero emissions provides you with that clear directionality. Knowledge creation and innovation, that's something that we're generally good at with R&D policies, innovation policies. Something we're not as good at yet when it comes to industry is about creating and reshaping markets. So de-risking, sharing risk, getting these investments into fossil-free industry. And possibly also, I don't know if I'm interested to hear what the next speaker says about this, the capacity for governance and change, because it might be different from, we have decades of institution building around energy and transport. We have whole departments in universities called transport and energy. Maybe we don't have that same capacity when it comes to industrial decarbonization. And then it's a sector where we need international coherence due to the risk of carbon leakage. And like in other cases, of course, taking care of labor and welfare policies to deal with phase out and the socioeconomic implications. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
It's sometimes frustrating to see the pathways you pictured out, and I had the same situation in a lecture when I started a lecture, and I made 90 minutes of lecture about these pathways and the 1.5 degree target, and I saw a lot of really frustrated faces afterwards. But on the other hand, you showed somehow a way out. So there is still a chance to get on track, perhaps not to 1.5 degree, but we might at least target something. So
I think, if you look at it from a resource point of view, technology and economic point of view, totally doable. That's why I highlighted this fossil fuel issue, because it's down to politics, and we have those countries with political, economic power concentrated, heavily invested in fossil fuels.
Yeah. So still we're facing a huge challenge here. Are there any questions or comments from the auditorium? I see two already.
Yeah, Andreas from EIIF. My question is actually, you showed that the renewables are actually getting to a price where the fossil fuels are. For me, the biggest difference between fossil fuels and renewables is that once the renewable plant is built, the fuel I'm using, the sun or the wind, doesn't send a bill. Whereas for oil or coal, I always have a bill because I need. Do you expect that this, in the balance of the price for the electricity, which you do with renewables compared to fossil fuels, are we too weak to communicate this big advantage? Was it clear, the question?
Yeah,
that you don't supply actually the fuel any longer. You have your plant, and it takes the energy from the sun. And I would expect from that moment on, it should be much cheaper than fossil fuels.
Well, I think, so the price might be low, but you still have the investment cost that you discount. So I don't think we can trick our way out of that. But it's interesting now to see also, I think with these big projects, that you don't only or simply sell your electricity on the spot market, but you go into these power purchase agreements, which creates stability both for the buyer and seller.
We have another question in the back here.
Didier Bosbeuf from ADEME, the French Agency for Ecological Transition. Tomorrow in the closing plenary, I will present the 4 pathways to decarbonize the French industry. And one of scenario is dealing with sufficiency. And I am comfortable to speak about sufficiency in transport and household. I have some views on what could be sufficiency. Now industry, it's a little bit more difficult. So could you say something or elaborate on that? What is sufficiency for you in industry? Since we will not reach our target without sufficiency.
Yeah.
Energy efficiency will be not enough.
I don't have any solution for that yet. I was talking to a big crowd of business people 2 weeks ago, also talking about demand reduction. And then I realized and looked at them, but you guys, you want to sell more, right? Not less. I don't have a solution there. I think we should nudge in the direction of sufficiency or demand management, tax reforms, various regulations, thinking about how we do urban planning and what kind of material demands that create. And I think it's also very much about social norms. But it's a difficult topic. And something which is underexplored from a policy point of view, because we've had energy efficiency policies since the oil crisis, but we don't have material efficiency policies. We have circular economy policies being developed, and basically we haven't really looked into sufficiency enough.
Erwin Cornelis, ECOS, Environmental Coalition and Standards, and I've liked very much your question, because I also have been puzzled about it with energy sufficiency in the context of industry. And well, the industry as an energy consumer, the industrial companies or company as an energy consumer by themselves, they are very rational and very well organized and try to look for the economic optimum. So there, I would say there was not that much gains to reap, but still, yes, this morning we've heard of apparatus that have been working for decades and not looked after, and something that can be reaped over there as gains. But if I think of energy sufficiency in the context of industry, I think that we need to look at the kind of products that they produce and having different products that last longer. If, for instance, appliances that can be repaired, and also other kinds of products, so that the product fulfills the same service for the end consumer, but in another way. I like to as an example, cow milk compared to soy milk, for instance. So both more or less the same purpose, but the carbon impact is very much different. This is my way of trying to answer your very interesting and very relevant question.
I think if you go for those options, it will be a very intricate web of policies and regulations and working against planned obsolescence, for example. But it's something to work on.
Yeah, and as time is progressing again, I thank you very much again.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks.
And I think we got a lot of food for thoughts already for the upcoming discussions, and now moving from the domain of science to the domain of policy making. So I welcome on stage Jean Bergevin, who is a UK-educated industrial economist, holds a PhD, and has held position at the International Energy Agency on the coal research unit, and was in the UK Department of Trade and Industry, and then started working at the European Commission in various DGs. So he was head of unit in DG Markt and DG Grow on industrial property rights. And in September 2020, so very quickly ago, very short time ago, he joined and returned to DG Grow as a senior expert working on the decarbonization pathways for the energy-intensive industries and the development of the European clean and low carbon hydrogen market. And yeah, Jean, we're happy to hear your perspective on the topic of industrial decarbonization.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I actually moved into this job in September 22, so it's even more recent. And you will have heard from my, well, you will see from my lack of hair that I've been around quite a time, and I moved out of coal a long time ago, but no disrespect to anybody here from there. I have a very challenging task here, as all Commission officials would complain, to give you the EU strategy for industrial decarbonisation. I think as Lars just said, and as I think the last question showed, we have many different policies which combine together and normally should result in the goal that we're all aiming for. And I'll try, honestly, I would bore you to death and it would last 2 hours if I went through it all. So I'm going to focus on the more recent policy issues that are linked to this subject, and also put it in the context of the energy crisis, which is with us at the moment because of obviously the conflict that we're seeing, the horrors in Ukraine. So I'll start by talking about that, and then, no disrespect to one of the questioners in the room, but simply because in DG Grow that's one area I deal with, I'll take one element of that and look at hydrogen. Not to market hydrogen, but maybe to show the challenges we have in developing the markets, or bringing to market these technologies and the value chains that go with them. In a manner, again, to ensure that we meet our objectives. So let me start a little bit, and the last part of my speech, because I'm not a member of Eceee, but I have been invited, I'm very happy to be here, is to encourage members of the Council to help us in that work, and I think you can, so hopefully wait for the punchline, as they say in English. So let's start with an overview of our ambition in terms of decarbonisation of industry, but put it in the context of the current also objective, which has come into this, which in a sense should help our objective, which is to reduce our dependence on Russian fossil fuels in particular, given the current situation. And all that was dealt with in a thing called the Repower EU plan, which was adopted on 18th of May of this year. And those measures include doubling the funding available for the 2022 call for the Innovation Fund for renewable projects to 3 billion euro this year. And as I said, those projects primarily seek to aim at innovative electrification and hydrogen applications across industry. The Commission also proposed to increase the EU's 2030 target for renewable electricity generation from the current 40% as the target to 45%. So to put it in perspective, that takes us to 1,000, here the figure is 236 gigawatts by 2030 of renewables. It also announced, and it was, some of you may have heard our president speaking of a so-called hydrogen bank. Well, a major part of that hydrogen bank is to develop schemes for what we call carbon contracts for difference, which would be supported also through the Innovation Fund. And you need to know the Innovation Fund is primarily financed through the ETS system. Okay. Such a contract for difference scheme would seek to subsidise the cost gap between renewable and fossil hydrogen, and in the absence of a sufficient green market premium to stimulate investment in renewable hydrogen. And note, I talk about renewable hydrogen. So the aim there is primarily hydrogen created from renewable energy. And you may know, some of those of you who are the policy geeks and follow what we do, that we have currently, there is a delegated act being proposed ensuring that such hydrogen is produced with additional renewables, right, not drawing from the grid. Before we can actually implement all that, we need a swift agreement in the Parliament and the Council on the latest phase of the Emission Trading Directive, which lays down the legal basis, one, for these contracts for difference that I mentioned about, as well as the budget in the Innovation Fund, which will help further those revenues that I mentioned earlier, those investments that I mentioned earlier. What else did we do? First of all, coming to a point that Lars said in Repower EU, we've provided concrete steps in May to develop far more renewable power purchase agreements, which are very important in this sector. And we've also tried to assist the energy-intensive sectors to weather the storm and to maintain their decarbonisation and reduce energy usage investment plans. That's the key thing there, that the concern we have is that the energy crisis could actually make certain projects to go, whether it's green steel or to decarbonise chemical plants, would actually either be put on ice or literally stopped. So to support the economy in the short term, the Commission adjusted its state aid framework with a so-called temporary crisis framework, which was adopted in March 2022. So it effectively allows member states to partially compensate companies, in particular SMEs, for additional costs due to the energy price increases. And that was amended in July to accelerate the rollout of renewable energy. So again, the focus is to be more open to state aid aimed primarily at renewable investments. And that has been yet again updated on 28th of October, and that framework will now extend to the end of 23. It's also, in a sense, we have tried to buffer industry from the effects of the crisis, and we came out with a Save Gas for a Save Winter communication last July, which you may know prioritises preventive savings in gas demand. And that includes a gas demand reduction plan, which specifies which sectors are critical and which should not obviously be cut out. But again, a lot of that is left still obviously to the member states. We set the criteria down, but it's for member states to determine which sectors, in a sense, are allocated or not gas. And finally, there was a regulation in October for an emergency intervention to address energy prices. That effectively introduced a cap on revenues on non-gas electricity producers, as well as a solidarity contribution on fossil fuel companies with the aim to redistribute such revenues to obviously vulnerable consumers, but also SMEs and industries that are energy intensive. But again, it's left to the member states to determine how to do that. So a lot of different measures, and I just want to, in a sense, put in context where we're going, because listening to some of the questions that were asked earlier, we are very much on an electrification path based on renewables. But that path and the infrastructure required for that needs very significant investment, not only in terms of new capacities, but also in the existing grid. As you know, renewables they're not a constant load, and there are therefore, you know this better than I, technical challenges and a need to strengthen the grid to deal with that. So all of that also requires on us having sufficient raw materials to do that. And in that context, be aware that the Commission is currently preparing a regulatory framework regarding what we call a European Raw Materials Act that we hope will come next year, and again will have very much a sustainability perspective to it. But I think that is important that we understand that there is a requirement, a very strong requirement for infrastructure to meet our objectives in terms of renewable electrification. Now, some have suggested that the current spikes in energy prices combined with carbon costs in the EU require more flexibility to be introduced in phase 4 of the emissions trading system and the accompanying carbon border adjustment mechanism. We don't consider that would be correct because, frankly, the system already has flexibility built into it. The ETS and carbon border adjustment mechanism of July 21, the ETS update, they've been carefully calibrated to support, not hinder, European competitiveness and to address carbon leakage. And those of you who know about the carbon border adjustment mechanism know that it's still very much in progress. There's testing phases before it will actually come into being. I think some in the audience here, and I wouldn't exclude myself from that, feel that it should come in sooner than later. But the Commission is being very careful to get it right, if I can put it that way. So where does that, in a sense, leave us? Well, I want to focus on hydrogen as an example, because I could have taken many subjects, but I will take this example, and to show the challenges we face, particularly, and that is the area that DG Grow, from where I come from, is involved with, which is very much getting the relevant technologies, the relevant systems, if you like, into the market. There is a lot of research going on, very good research. We need more, that is clear. We're very good at, and we saw the hybrid plant getting to the pre-commercial stage. That plant is actually a very good example of getting to commercial stage, because I actually understand it will go on a commercial scale as of 2026. What's interesting in that example, and Lars may know that one of the reasons it will only go in 26 is because of permitting rules. To actually go to that commercial scale, it will have taken 10 years to get the permitting through. So, this shows the complexity of the legal framework behind this. I've skimmed over it. But to come to hydrogen, I'd simply say in response to the first question that it is not, hydrogen is certainly not a panacea, but if we do go to renewables and to renewable electricity, we estimate that we will need it in terms for buffering the system, okay? So to give you an idea, we have looked very much, and this is our colleagues in DG ENA who use their different models to estimate what we would need looking at 2050. And we've come to, and I'll give you the estimates here, our projections, and this was set out in an impact assessment in what is called our hydrogen and gas markets package, which came out last year, that by 2050, some 20% of our energy mix will consist of non-fossil gaseous fuels. So that's not just, to be used for buffering on the electricity system, it's also for mobility issues. We've talked, following the presentation this afternoon from the Port of Antwerp in terms of fuels, etc. Hydrogen plays a role in that. And those 20%, it's not just hydrogen, that covers biogas, biomethane, synthetic methane, and renewable and low carbon hydrogen. That's another thing that I'm going to be very open about. The aim is to go to renewable. Meanwhile, low carbon, what do we mean by low carbon? We mean nuclear generated. And as long as that nuclear is seen as a transitional element to draw on as we move to this full renewable perspective. So that, to give you a figure, just for the renewable hydrogen perspective, so purely renewable, That translates to 70 to 80 million tons of hydrogen per year in 2050. Now, remember, these are estimates, but you've got to go from the basis that we're at less one, today, or even zero. Very, very nearly zero. So the 2030 milestone that we'd expected was 10 million tons, including imports. And in Repower EU, we actually doubled that. So we're aiming, or that's the political objective, I should say, at 10 million tons produced, renewable, produced within the EU, and 10 million tons imported into the EU, whether through pipelines, whether through liquid carriers, and that we're talking in 2030, which is it's not that far away. Now, what have we done, therefore? What are we doing to, in a sense, create the market for this? Because remember, it's not just you've got to produce the hydrogen, you need the electrolyzer capacity to do that, you need the infrastructure to distribute it, you need the applications to use it. And it's not sector specific. We've talked about green steel, so there's certainly heavy industry, and people tend to see hydrogen as, a key player, or a player, excuse me, in the decarbonising the so-called hard-to-abate heavy industries. But it also has a role, as I said, regarding fuels and in terms of electricity generation. So how do we get markets like that working? What we're piloting, or what we've created, and this is one example, we have others, we're about to launch one on solar, are what we call alliances. So we have a clean hydrogen alliance that we created just over or under 2 years ago, where the aim is to bring all the different actors, and that includes research institutes, investors, public authorities, and the different industries, the suppliers, but also the users, into an alliance where we can actually focus in on the key bottlenecks, the key issues that face the development of this kind of pathway. We have currently 1,700 or more, actually, members in the alliance. And the aim is really also to synchronize investments in all these, across these different sectors, bringing together demand and supply at the European level. And that's very important. You can aim to, and we tend to do this as policymakers, say, okay, right, we will produce hydrogen and then the market will sort it out. Well, no, because that's a future market. You actually have to, with this perspective of decarbonisation, you have to really tailor it to what the needs are and bring those partners together. The idea that all this can be done through public finance is a pipe dream. You need massive investments, and you need to bring in the commercial players earlier. We've already, in that time that the alliance has been in place, we've had a number of, I would say, deliverables. We've created what we call a hydrogen, and this may sound odd, but I'll explain in a second, a public funding compass. Because one of the first things that the project developers came in and said, look, you've got all these different funds, as have the member states, and we really don't understand where we can actually, where should we apply, through which portal, etc. That sounds ridiculous, but it's actually the real case. So we set up that portal to at least facilitate that. We also, working with the Alliance and ourselves with JRC, etc., looked at the projects and developed a project pipeline. There are, as in 2021, at the end of 2021, we had 768 projects across, as I said, the whole of that hydrogen system in our pipeline. And a further 150 have been added since that date in terms of updating it. Just to give you an idea of what that implies, if you look at the projects that we have, we're talking about around 68 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity being foreseen in that pipeline today, which is nearly at the 80 gigawatts we would require if we wanted to be really on the safe side for our 2030 target. Okay, so we're still not there yet. Those projects have led to, some of them, the larger ones have been subsidized in what we, in terms, and they are considered to be important projects of community European interest. This is where a series of member states come together and bring forward major projects aimed at, in this case, decarbonisation for a specific assessment in, again, our state aid framework. We have had 2 IPCIs adopted to date. The first involved 41 projects. This was in production, and that spanned 15 member states, and we're talking about 5.5 billion of state aid and 8.8 billion of commercial investment. That's for the first. The second, which was more usage projects, the respective figures were 5.2 billion and 7 billion, and we're talking about 37 projects. So these are all coming, all this is coming through this alliance. And another element that we've got is a strong commitment by electrolyzer manufacturers to upgrade their capacity in order to produce the required capacity that we have for our targets. Now, I could go on, I won't. I think that what I will come to is a key issue that is coming through the alliance. And although, remember, investors are in the alliance, the big issue is bringing the commercial investors into the market. And the big problem for them is very much to foresee or to have an assessment, if you like, of the energy competitiveness or efficiency that drives the specific projects. Okay, so you need a kind of ex-ante energy audit. They're looking into the unknown. Banks are hard-nosed, they always have been. And they're yet, and this is very important, they are now largely also, not largely, they've been encouraged to, I would say, also by ourselves in another area of regulation, to green their portfolios. And I'm talking about not just banks, I'm talking about asset managers, and I'm talking about insurers. And they are looking for metrics to assess which projects are sustainable, green, and viable. Okay, that's their business. They're not in it for charity, let's be clear. So the key, and they are seriously, they are looking for those metrics. We work with development banks who are members of the alliance. So that's the, for example, the European Investment Bank, who also work with the commercial banks. And this is the main bottleneck, if you like, that we are facing. Now, my humble view is that the Eceee has information, does papers, does look at the issue of how you assess the energy efficiency of a system. We were talking about Anto as well. It is not just the energy efficiency of one particular technology, it is of a system, an overall system. And so I would hope that in that regard, that members of the Eceee will consider, this isn't a call to join the alliance necessarily, but I hope that we can work together to address those issues in the coming years. Many thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the challenge you outlined in really transforming the whole economy underlines the importance of energy efficiency, because the less energy we actually need over the whole value chain, and the systemic view, I think, is of uttermost importance, because every kilowatt hour we save in the end will save us the need for investment. And I don't say investment is a bad thing, but it makes the challenge smaller in the end. So I think this is a thing which empowers each other to be rational and responsible with the use of energy, and then build up the infrastructure to fulfill the remaining needs. Yeah. So that's the way forward in the end. Yeah. I've seen a question in the audience here. So Erwin.
Erwin Cornelis of ECOS, Environmental Coalition Standards, and well, we are part of the alliance, and so we're looking forward to the next meeting on December the 5th.
Yeah.
I have a question about the application side, of the industrial application side of hydrogen. So if you're talking about using hydrogen, whether it's, for instance, hydrogen in steel making, you need a new plant. So you can't continue with the blast furnace. You actually need to demolish the blast furnace and you build something completely new. Also, if you would like to use hydrogen as a fuel in high temperature applications, you also need to make quite some adjustments because hydrogen combusts in a different way than natural gas does. And my question concerned this change, more drastic change that's needed at the industry.
Yeah.
And what are the drivers there? And I also would like to make the link with the climate law. There is a call to make a sectoral decarbonization roadmap, something like that.
Yeah.
Whether is it linked? Thank you.
Well, I think it is. I think the key. I think relating to Lars's presentation, I would love to think, and don't correct me here, that we were all on one planet aiming at the same objective. We are all on one planet, but unfortunately, and I'm not saying Europe is better than anybody else, we're not all aiming at the same objective. And to get the investments required, this comes back, that's why we have to make sure they are required first, but the investments required for these transitions are massive. You heard the figures that I put here in these IPCIs. We're talking billions. And by the way, and I don't want to sound old hand here, you know, right now, none of these projects would be taking place without public money, right? So all the more reason, I think, that you know, vis-a-vis we live in democracies, we have to justify that these projects work and work effectively to meet our objectives. So they're enormous investments. And that's the big problem. I think that's what, from the Alliance point of view, or certainly from my perspective looking at this work, I think we tend to put out there the top level objective, right? So of course, decarbonisation, that's clear. And then we come down and we say, right, we want renewables. Fine. To give you an anecdote, and it is an anecdote, I was speaking to a major European bank recently who is interested in moving to this area, but was interestingly saying actually the most viable off-taker for us to look at now is synthetic aircraft fuels. Okay, and using hydrogen in the production of that, and you also need carbon in there. Not good. And you say, well, why is that? Because jet fuel is so expensive that this one is the one that we think we can go for first, which is exactly the opposite of where we are, because we want to decarbonize heavy industry first. That's, you know, but once you start looking, and that's not to say that bankers should determine our priorities, no disrespect to any who are here, but the investment, the level of investment required for this is so great that we have to really consider that. Now, let me give you another example of that. We were talking about wind farms. Okay, we need steel for that, okay, for those plants. Ideally, we would want those to, you know, to drive that in time to green steel, ideally, okay? Right now, we compete internationally for windmills. I don't think we should use wind turbines, let's put it that way. And moreover, we're seeing, and this again is not a criticism, but a race to subsidies. You would have seen, some of you, that the Inflation Reduction Act in the US puts very high possibilities in terms of tax credits to subsidize hydrogen production and usage in the US. Now, I'm not saying it's a good bit of news that the US is, if I can be honest, going down a greener route that it may have been doing in the past administration. On the other hand, you're back in this competitive position where, if you take our own projects, where we, in terms of state aids, we provide capex, some of those projects, given that the energy crisis is particularly hitting our European continent, will no longer take place and will shift to the US because of that. That's not necessarily the most, how can I say, the best way to develop this market. But that's the reality check. So I do think that the investment requirements are something that we need to focus on. And as you know, in the Alliance, that's what we're trying to do.
Both your DG Growth and ourselves, we support European manufacturers, European industries.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good to see that there's put a lot of thought and a lot of resources in something that might happen in 15 or 20 years. But what a lot of companies are struggling these days is basically to pay bills.
Yeah.
And it's why don't we support more measures like industrial insulation or heat pumps or arc furnaces from the South European Union, rather than looking at something, I mean, there might be no EU in 20 years.
Well, yes. Well, I hope not. I hope there is, even though I'll be retired by then. But I think we do. This is not. I've been talking about what the major projects are in terms of decarbonisation. It is true that our goal, so our industrial policy, if you like, who we help, is very much linked now to greening our industry. I'm not going to deny that that is the main driver. I've also said, though, that during this crisis, and we've been certainly seeking to do that, we want to obviously assist our industry. There's one issue here. I'm responsible also for the EIs in the energy-intensive industries. One of the big issues that we see right now is mothballing of plants, reduction of capacity, and people being laid off. Well, we're not sitting back on that. We're certainly not sitting back on that, and there's discussions ongoing, with the member states. Now, the big issue here, and now I won't go off completely, but member states typically will use different systems of state aids to assist for that, as they did during the COVID crisis, because we are not looking at a rosy picture for next year, as you all know. What we need to do, and that's certainly something that my commissioner, with Commissioner Gentiloni, has been writing about, is to see how we can equilibrate that across member states. And this is no disrespect, but the bigger member states obviously have more firepower to assist in these kinds of situations, and that also can distort the market, within Europe. So I wouldn't say that we dropped industry, because that's not the case.
No, but it's important to keep things in proportion, to see how much hydrogen can contribute. I mean, we had working on kind of energy transition. We have had kind of derailing with the CCS. We had 15 years of discussions of CCS, which in a way slowed down energy transition for industrial energy users in some people's opinions. And now, I'm just worried that we don't have enough time, to spend another 15 years talking about technology that might not come up.
Well, I don't. To be honest, as I said, I focus on hydrogen not because that's the Commission focus, that's the area I deal with, but just to answer you to that, I don't see, and certainly that's not Bergerman's view, I think that's a general view, that we can move to dependency on renewable electricity without having those balancing fuels, of which hydrogen is part of them. Now, you will say from an energy efficiency point of view, that's crazy, but I don't think you can fill that gap solely, for example, with hydro and with the cost that would come to. That is, I think, the reality. And the other thing is that for the heavy to decarbonize industries such as steel, that's, to give an idea, if you take Sweden, if those plants shift to, if those blast furnaces shift to DRI with hydrogen, you're talking about a saving, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Lars, of 8% of the carbon emissions for the whole of Sweden, right? So I do think it has value in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Jean. And due to the time which is progressing, and not to be interfering with the coffee break, which is of course also an essential part of the conference, I will end the Q&A now, but I hope you will continue the discussion in the coffee break. Also, Jean will be there. So thank you, Jean, again for the presentation.
Thank you.